thank you so much for joining us. I can't tell you how delighted we are that you're here, and we're delighted that we're here to talk to you. This time, we're going to be presenting something on behalf of the Scaling Community of Practice, and I'll begin by just telling you a word or two about that for those of you who are new. The Scaling Community of Practice is now something north of 5,000 people in 127 countries, united really by just a single belief, which is that we can do better. We can do better meeting the climate problems and meeting the development needs and humanitarian challenges facing the world today if we think seriously about what it takes to create durable, sustainable solutions at scale. And that at scale is the basis of today's conversation. When the Community of Practice started, now coming up on 12 years ago, we focused almost exclusively and have for most of our duration at the field level. What does it really take for particular things in particular places to go to scale and stay there? We took 3 years ago a little bit of a detour, and we decided to focus especially on funders. Why funders? Not because they're the most important player in this, but because they're an important player and have the capacity both to accelerate and in some cases to distort the way people pursue scale. Over those 3 years, we did 28 case studies. We did 3 multilateral development banks. We did 3 bilateral funders. We did 6 innovation funders, 6 vertical funds, 2 NGOs, and most importantly for today, 8 private foundations. In each case, looking at their internal policies, procedures, systems, and the way they did or didn't take into account what's necessary to produce durable solutions at scale. 3 of those examples are, we thought, particularly interesting as a kind of a bird's eye view of what foundations are doing these days and how it has the potential to really change in important dimensions the way the whole development and climate enterprise operate. And those 3 we're lucky enough to have with us today. The case studies were in each case done either by insiders or by someone like one of us, but in clear collaboration with insiders. In 2 of these cases, the person inside the organization was already the principal author of the case study. First is going to be Abe Grindle from Co-Impact, who's the program director at Co-Impact and the author of the case study on Co-Impact. And there's going to be Dana Schmidt from Echidna Giving, who was again the author of the case study about Echidna Giving. And we're lucky enough to have 2 from the Gates case study. Matt Eldridge, who was inside at the time and is an advisor on development and climate finance at Gates, and Simon Winter, now a vice president at Rockefeller Catalytic Capital, but at the time, a member of our team here at the Global Community of Practice and the principal author of the case study, working with Matt and folks inside. I've got a series of questions, but we suspect you do too. And the way we'd like to do this is to ask you to please make very active use of the chat function, either for comments if you prefer, or for questions. And my colleague Todd will be monitoring that as we go along. We'll pause twice along the way to take questions that you might have. So don't be shy about this. We've allocated time for the purpose and we'd like to use it to best effect. So anything that comes up as we go along, please turn it into a question or a comment, put it into the chat box, and we'll get to as many as we can. With no further ado, let me turn then to the first question and to you, Abe. And I want you to reflect, if you would, for us a little bit on Co-Impact's journey. Now, unlike most of us who came to scaling a little late and along the way, maybe in frustration with the project approach that we've taken, Co-Impact was really designed with scale as a principle on this. Now, tell us a little bit about what the implications of that were. What did you mean by scale, and what did that mean for how you saw your own role?
Yeah, happy to, Larry, and thanks for the opportunity. Maybe I'll start just with a brief word on the origin of Co-Impact. So we're about 10 years old, and we were founded by Olivia Leland, who spent 2 years before she launched really going out and talking to hundreds of social change leaders around the world and asking them, what do you all wish that philanthropy would look like next? What could philanthropy do to try and better support you and your aspirations for impact in the world? And really what she came to out of all that was what became Co-Impact. So basically, we define scale and kind of our mission and aspiration as like this 3-part goal or equation equation, if you will, where each of these three aspects is kind of co-equal in importance with the others. So first, obviously, is impact. Like what is the meaningful, inclusive, equitable impact in people's lives that is resulting from the work at scale, right? Which is very straightforward. We were talking a lot about it today. And then in a way that is durable. So that is about what is the durable change or strengthening, usually of the relevant government or market system, that will lead to the improvements in people's lives at the scale of the problem. So those three aspects, impact, scale, and durability, co-equally with one another, are really kind of the core essence and focus of how Co-Impact thinks about its work and about change at scale. To your second question about like how do we think about our role in this, I'd offer kind of a few pieces to that. One is that we are a pooled fund. So we are basically a platform where donors can come together, pool their resources, align with one another, and kind of together create even bigger change at scale in a more efficient way to support these social change leaders than many of them are able to do themselves. So we pooled about $850 million from 60 donors all around the world to date to do this work. We focus that support then on global South, locally rooted change leaders who have the savviness, the standing, the relationships, and the long-standing commitment to kind of drive this work forward. We focus as Co-Impact on kind of that middle stage of work. So not the early stage R&D, but really where there is a ripe opportunity to really achieve strengthening or change of these systems at scale. So right in that kind of mid-level sweet spot. And we think of ourselves as a bit of a booster rocket in some sense, where we come alongside the other funders and the other support that these organizations already have and try and give them an extra push to kind of get over that that initial kind of first wave of really kind of driving the change, the strengthening at the scale in the given system in which they're working in. For us, it's about a 6 to 8 year relationship. We think that's really how long it really takes to do some of this work, well, sometimes even longer. And we really focus on long-term flexible support, with the North Star always being that ultimate change at scale aspiration that we share. So I'll stop there, but happy to go into more detail as the session goes on. Thanks.
Would it be fair to say that it's using project or projects to produce something that's no longer a project?
I'm not sure exactly that's how we would characterize it. We actually try and avoid the project language entirely because we think that
even for what you're doing.
We find that evokes a lot of like classic developmental models of like it's a project owned by an NGO that they want to kind of throw over the fence to government or something like that. We think much more of like, okay, what is the improvement in the system that you, based on all your knowledge, experience, kind of resources, the system itself, everybody collectively wants to see, and what is then the work to kind of drive that change, that strengthening of the system at scale?
Dana, would it be fair to say that Echidna Giving didn't necessarily start out with scale as its North Star, but has definitely moved toward that increasingly over time? And if that's fair, what needed to change to make that happen? How did you actually drive that change internally?
Thanks, Larry. Well, I would say Echidna Giving, like Co-Impact, is actually a relatively young player in the foundation space. So we've only had full-time staff for the past 10 years. So have not been at this a super long time, but I would say it is fair to say that we have, as we have staffed up and grown sort of our own internal capacity, as well as our own internal sort of formalizing of our strategies and processes, I think it's fair to say that we've been refining and centering sort of this idea of impact at scale more centrally in our work. And simply for the reason that philanthropy Echidna Giving works on the issue of education, and philanthropy is a vanishingly small percent of the dollars spent on education, right? So if you look at what low-income countries around the world spend on education, it's about $270 billion a year. And if you look at the top funders in international education, we maybe collectively give $1 to $2 billion a year. So we're just nowhere near the scale of government funding. So we think very much about how can the funding we give hopefully catalyze better use of government dollars and better outcomes for kids. So over time, I would say sort of within Echidna Giving, we've gotten more comfortable funding work that isn't just about directly reaching and impacting, education outcomes for children, but also about influencing others. We've done more work directly, in advocacy, for example, which I think was not at all part of our early grant making portfolio. And then I would also say that as we've grown and done more to just sort of explicitly refine our strategy and talk about the principles driving our work, we have started talking and formalizing our intent to sort of enable systems change and think about an impact at scale. So it just means that we've become much more intentional about that as we've become intentional about everything in our grant making. And we've also gone, I think, in the early days, it kind of very much, didn't pick specific geographies, saw ourselves as more of a global funder. And I think because we see where there are particular opportunities in particular places and some advantages to focusing in where those opportunities lie, we've now more narrowed our focus on East Africa and India in particular for right now. So we've, done more advocacy funding, done more thinking of ourselves, not just globally, but in particular geographies, and refined and honed that approach over time.
Perfect. Thanks.
Sure.
Simon, you had a little bit of a different vantage point on this in that you were writing about and learning about Gates as you did this, and you weren't inside Gates. I'm wondering two things. One is, especially as you looked in from the outside, what really struck you, and to what extent the fact that Gates is such a large foundation and so diverse in the things that it did influence the way it approaches scale, or the way it approaches scale differently in different parts of the organization.
Thanks, Larry. So I was brought in by the partnerships and finance group at Gates, which Matt was part of, to undertake this case study. So that group works right across the foundation, but there are many, as the Gates Foundation calls it, program strategy teams, even I get it wrong, PSTs for short. And we decided in conjunction with foundation leadership to focus on two in the health sector, agriculture, which is the part of Gates that I had interacted with a lot prior to doing the case study, and digital public infrastructure. And it was very striking, I think, on the positive side, that scaling was very much part of how all those teams thought about their work, but there was very different ways that they then went about their work on scaling. So at one end, it was, we've got certain products, for example, for maternal and child health that we want to see scale because they're going to help low-income women and mothers significantly deal with some of the challenges they're facing, but it was very much a product scaling approach. Whereas you had on the other end, DPI, or the Digital Public Infrastructure Group, there was, no, the system is at scale. If we're going to be successful, we have to understand how to guide solutions at that system level, and so scaling is held in that. In terms of, I think what Gates being a larger foundation than many, how they approach this, they definitely don't see themselves as the scaling partner. They see them very much themselves, as many foundations do, as catalytic. But they have the financial resources to do that catalytic work at a larger scale than many others. So what of that? I think some of the differences from other foundations that I was observing, one is that the Gates Foundation has a lot of technical expertise internally within the foundation. They have big PSTs, and they hire excellent people with a lot of experience to drive their content. So they start from a point of expertise. Secondly, they see that they can support right across the system from developing market assessments of what is the addressable market for the solution, which they do in pretty much every case, supporting innovations that can be even support at the research end of innovations, let alone the then testing the proof of concept for research and so on, all the way through to then catalyzing catalytic intermediaries and market players to invest in the scaling work and playing a role with innovative financial instruments in terms of de-risking those investments. I think the next point is that they also support around the scaling, even when it's a product scaling. They will look at capacity and capability, for example, of delivery partners. They will look at policy research to understand the enabling environment challenges. And they will also invest not only in de-risking the financing, but actually making sure that some of the financing organizations, the World Bank in particular, has been a key partner for the Gates Foundation, that they in turn have the capabilities and capacities to do the scaling work, which in some cases means they've funded the World Bank or other DFIs and so on. And then fourthly, I think the fact that they have Bill, who is obviously a household name worldwide, to help with some of that influencing and guiding, whether it's on the policy end or whether it's on the private sector end and so on, is a key asset that they like to use as well. I think the one caveat I would say is that they're somewhat challenged, however, by that size and by the culture, which is very decentralized culture, not only to PST level, but even within PSTs, which has meant, as I was looking at scaling across those PSTs, I was seeing quite, different approaches, different methods and so on, and not a lot of dialogue and conversation about scaling methods and scaling approaches and metrics and so on across those PSTs.
That's a good place to bring you in, Matt. If you're looking at the same proposition from the inside, would you share the way Simon characterized it? And particularly, I'm interested in one piece of what he was talking about. I didn't prep you on this question, but I think it's important, which is the stuff which is not maybe indeterminate in terms of outcome, which is trying to work with the various system players in this that influence outcomes, but are not necessarily subject to the normal sort of project interventions.
Yeah, thanks, Larry. And yes, I broadly agree with most of Simon's characterization and worked with him closely on the case study. One nuance I would highlight is that scale is not usually treated within the foundation as a standalone objective, right? We're not trying to scale for the sake of scale, right? And as Simon says, we don't see ourselves as the scaler. We are catalytic in our view. We're really just trying to achieve impact at scale and finding the right pathway and model and partners to achieve that impact. And the impact target, right, varies by team. As Simon noted, it's quite a large foundation, but broadly it's about saving lives from preventable deaths, improving quality of life, expanding access to opportunity for people who are otherwise least likely to benefit from innovation or investment. And so focusing on impact at scale matters because it shapes how the foundation sees its role when it comes to scaling. And we often describe ourselves less as the actor that will scale everything directly and more as that catalytic partner. Simon's report.
Do you think the organization's size relative to other foundations is material in that, or you think it's basically, if it were a third or a quarter its size, it would probably do much the same thing, just less of it?
I mean, that's a good question. I think the size is material relevant. I mean, I think our own scale gives us the ability to take on long horizon problems, very large problems, to invest in evidence at scale, to support product development that can take a long time and involves many different interconnected risks. We can reduce some of these costs, the affordability barriers, deploy tools like quality guarantees at scale that others may not be able to. And foundations in general are very good at being able to leverage their convening power. But I think the large size of the foundation uniquely enables us in some ways to leverage some of those convening powers that we have as philanthropies. But I mean, I think the purpose of doing this is not as a substitute, right, for those systems that exist there. It's really to make the solutions more likely to work through existing systems, and how can we catalyze specific changes within those systems. And one example of that I might cite is our work on solutions that require private markets. So promising technologies or delivery models might need viable markets, financing, supply chains, policy environments, adoption pathways, if they're really going to reach the people that they intend to at the scale and sustainability that they aspire to. And we help with that both through grants as well as non-grant instruments like debt, equity, volume guarantees. But no matter the tool, what we're trying to do in those instances is catalyzing markets rather than deals. So really addressing what we see as a perceived or real risk or barrier to viable markets that is preventing scale, and deploying our catalytic capital in ways that really maximize our additionality. And so just one additional thing behind our approach is really the pragmatic view of how philanthropy can leverage its own comparative advantage by taking the specific risks, so de-risking products, platforms, delivery models, and markets, and really thinking through moving towards more transformational scaling through the institutions, through the partners that we can help capacitate, who are able to actually carry that work on, because we're not on the ground doing that work, right, as a philanthropy.
I'm actually hoping we can get back during this conversation to the role of governments, the role of markets, and these intermediation functions that you're talking about. That's actually a good bridge back to you, Abe. I'll look in the rearview mirror here just a little bit. And I happen to know you well enough to know you spent a long time at Bridgespan before you came to Co-Impact. And one of the advantages that affords you is you've looked at a lot of other organizations besides your own who are going through these sorts of things. When you came into Co-Impact with that experience base, what struck you as different or sort of distinguishing about the way Co-Impact was going at that? And does it feel like others are kind of getting that message, or is it a kind of a secular learning process that everyone's absorbing, or is it still a dividing point between what most organizations do and what a few are starting to do?
Yeah, I mean, I think the exciting part is I do think it really has been a sector-wide movement over the last, for what I've seen, 10 years. So at Bridgespan, there were the last few years I was there, we were really engaging in this question prompted by all of the change leaders in the NGOs and philanthropies that we were supporting, asking what would it look like to create change at the scale of the problem, right? Like that was really the animating question. Co-Impact was one of the responses. There are others in different contexts, right? Like founded about 10 years ago. And I now see, we were together, Larry, at school a few weeks ago, right? Like, and what's really exciting is to see like this conversation really just spreading across the whole sector.
It was a shocking shift. If I can just come in for a second, I was really astounded, even from last year to this year.
Yeah, and so to me, I see huge, really exciting progress, and not only prompted by all the aid cuts last year, right? Like, but part of a longer arc of kind of thinking that's been happening. I would say what's most important or unique, right, like of those of us, including on this call, that are really deep in this work is really the appreciation of all three factors that each of us, I think, in some degree has been talking about today, which is, this three-part goal of its impact at scale that will endure and is sustainable. Right. And really trying to put all three of those things co-equal with one another. I think my biggest observation is that in the past, we've focused on maybe one or two at most of those three factors. Usually it's impact, effect size is often the shorthand for it. So it also leaves out, things like equity, things like inclusion, et cetera. Scale has more and more become part of the lexicon and the focus. But this third piece around durability and sustainability of change, I think it's starting to really get elevated now as people come to appreciate the importance of governments, markets, and so forth. And the idea that philanthropy is fickle and it is finite, right? And it is such a tiny fraction of the resources needed. So what's most exciting to me is to see that third kind of component start to kind of come co-equal with the others, because then I think finally we're starting to fully describe the problem that we're trying to solve. And that leads us to a set of solutions, but also ways of working both as funders and as change leaders on the ground, that are best aligned to achieve that, what I would call the true objective that we've always had, but I don't think we've often articulated it as fully as we are today.
Yep. Dana, take us kind of inside the tent a little bit on this. So I know your thinking is in many ways parallels to stuff that Abe was just saying, but when you bring that inside and say, what does it mean internally for the way the foundation operates, who you hire, or how you approve projects, what sorts of criteria you measure it against, give us a little bit of a flavor as to how this scaling mentality affects some or all of those things.
Sure. And I think we could spend a lot of time unpacking that because there's a lot of dimensions to that. So I'll try to speak to just a few, and I guess from the Echidna Giving perspective. So I already mentioned for us that we've started to think a little bit more about specific geographies, and part of that is because we also need to hire individuals to manage our grant portfolios, and we've decided that it's important to have folks who are more proximate to the work, who really understand the context, the political economy in the countries where our grantees are working, so they can think about what does it take to bring those three ingredients that Abe was talking about together through our grant making. So we have program leads now who manage each of our portfolios in our geographies. We've kind of divided our portfolio so that we have a few key themes within education that we're working to advance. So just to give one example, we work on early childhood education, and we have a program lead for that in India. We have another program lead for that in East Africa. And they are really thinking, how do I build a portfolio of grantees who can, really begin to hopefully influence what happens? How do we expand access to high quality early learning opportunities for children across the countries in which we're working? And they can think about that not just with individual grantees, which is important, right? So we do think at an individual grantee level, how are they positioning themselves to think about what is the problem that they're trying to solve in that space, and how are they thinking about the sustainability of their work? All of those three ingredients that Abe was talking about before. What's the impact they want to have, and how do they do that at scale in a durable way, which often in the education space means through government, right? This question of if philanthropy can't fund it at scale, who should? I think in our case in education, the answer is government systems. So they're thinking about that. Not every organization is equally well positioned to do all things that might be required to have impact at scale that lasts, but across a portfolio, we can stitch that together, and that's what our program leads are doing. I guess, a few other things just at the individual partner level that we look for. So we certainly look for folks who are thinking about how to align and influence local government education systems. We look for organizations who really have a strong learning culture, because we're not going to get these things right the first time, right? So how are they iterating, learning what's working and shifting based on what they learn? We look for folks who are not just about how do we grow our organization, but are thinking about how do we grow our influence and are poised for having greater influence on other actors in the sector. And we also look for organizations that are locally led and locally based. Abe kind of raised this point earlier for co-impact, but we just think those organizations have strong legitimacy in their systems, and a greater stake in what happens in those systems, and therefore a better chance at influencing it. I guess just to say, there's also as a number of just kind of ways of working as a foundation that we think are really important, that have always been important to our work and remain important as we think about the scaling objective. So one is staying the course. So Abe referenced foundations kind of being notorious for being fickle. We really kind of emphasize the importance of sticking to issues over the long term, and have made a 10+ year commitment on the current themes we are working to advance within Echidna Giving. We think it's really important to have long-term and flexible support for grantees who are working on this endeavor that takes a long time to be successful at, and on building really strong relationships with our partners, which also means building a culture where internally we have strong relationships with each other, sort of modeling the trust and strong relationships and empowerment that we think are critical for partners to have with our partners, and for our partners to have with their partners, like government entities and communities. So I'm sure I could speak for much longer, but I'll wrap up there. I think there's a lot to say on this topic of just what does it take internally to make this happen.
Matt, pick up on that, but stay on the theme I started you and Simon on before, which is the size and diversity of the Gates Foundation itself. When you look at it from that point of view, do you have a take on why and how these different program areas differ from one another in their approach to issues like the ones that Abe and Dana were talking about? Is it kind of just the history of each one, or is it the nature of what they do? And to the extent there's anything evolving that you might think of as internal learning or best practices, is there anything that either does exist or that you can imagine existing that would spread this more evenly or elevate the level of others inside the foundation?
Yeah, I mean, program areas at Gates definitely do differ in terms of how they approach scaling. I think that observation that Simon picked up on in his earlier remarks and in the case study is accurate. But I mean, I certainly would frame that as a necessary response to the diversity of what the foundation is trying to achieve. We're working across a really broad set of issues and geographies as a nature of the scale that the foundation has. So we have over 50 program strategies, if my math is correct, and we have partners in over 130 countries. So it's quite large. That means the problems we are trying to achieve or to address are highly heterogeneous. Some are fundamentally about things like product development, others about delivery systems or markets or public finance or policy. And many of these are focused on all of these at the same time. So it's a very complex variety of different things. I wouldn't expect or want a single scaling model across all of Gates because teams working on things like vaccine delivery, smallholder agriculture, digital public infrastructure, or US education, right? They're all going to face very different scaling questions with different institutions, different political economy, different financing pathways, and different roles for communities and local actors. I think Simon's report captures that well, that there's such diversity across scaling approaches in different program teams, but there's an underlying trajectory of moving forward from innovation towards sustainable scale. So you might describe our scaling model as shared mission, shared principles, but tailored pathways. You need to have that flexibility in pathways to design a scaling strategy that really fits the issue area. But in practical terms, there are maybe a few ways that teams can build on the best of what's already happening. First is doing a better job internally of making scaling practices more visible. There's a lot of tacit knowledge at the foundation. Teams have learned when to work with governments, when to catalyze markets, when to support multilaterals, when to invest in different types of pathways. But that knowledge doesn't always easily travel across teams. Anyone who's worked in a large organization or even a mid-sized organization probably knows that. Communities of practice can sometimes help with that. And some teams are already doing versions of this within their own team. So agricultural development, for instance, that team already has a community of practice focused on scaling and working on how you take innovation into complex smallholder systems in sub-Saharan Africa and in South Asia. Second is maybe codifying learning without over-standardizing it. I don't think we really need a rigid scaling template that every team must follow, but maybe a common set of questions, like what is the unit of scale, who adopts, who pays, who delivers. Third would be, I think we can keep learning from areas where the foundation is already working through larger systems. So a good example of that is our work with multilateral development banks. We have hundreds of millions of dollars of grants that we've worked through multilateral development banks, and we built these partnerships through, you might say, blood, sweat, and tears of understanding each institution's respective strengths, constraints, what we're each looking for, how we perceive each other, and can we build on that so that future partnerships really can learn from and benefit from what's worked and what hasn't worked as well as maybe either party expected. So yeah, I guess I would summarize like scaling approaches differ, and I really think they should though.
Thanks so much. And Simon, as you look at this from the outside in, did it seem to you like there were missed opportunities within the foundation to for one part to help another or to build on best practices?
Well, first of all, I certainly agree with what Matt says, and part of the recommendations was some, specific ideas about how to evolve more of a common language and a common framework to embrace that diversity, the necessary diversity, as Matt talks about, and how to put in place more learning loops and so on that could be more easily shared across the PSTs within the foundation, and potentially to support with some standardized metrics, not outcome metrics or impact metrics, but metrics related to approaches to scaling. And then also, I think in terms of internal enablers for scaling, looking at being choiceful about some of the trade-offs that are being made. For example, when is it most appropriate in what circumstances to think about, a somewhat more transactional approach, because what you're trying to do is scale adoption of specific products that are already proven to have, very significant benefits versus, the more system change, system strengthening type of scaling that might be more appropriate when you're trying to do something that needs to involve more than just a product. It requires behavior change by organizations or institutional strengthening in order to ensure delivery can be scaled into underserved communities, for example. So that's more on the, let's say, how to scale and enablers of scaling. And I want to pick up also on what Dan has said about portfolio, thinking about carefully about how do you optimize the portfolio. I think something the foundation's now doing because it only has 19 years left. So what are those choices about? Where does it hand off? At what point does it hand off in those 19 years? What does it keep to the end? And so on. I think the other piece, very briefly, is, on the how to scale. Some thoughts there were, how, and I think this is relevant to all of us in international development these days, and certainly part of what I'm now doing at Rockefeller. How do we scale with global South partners, not always relying on perhaps traditional development partners? What is the role of country platforms or some kind of country coordination mechanism so that, even though perhaps our preferred scaling pathway is the private sector, there's an engagement with the government for policy change or other forms of enablers to support that scaling. And then finally, Matt talked about the role of MDBs as one of the principal scaling partners, but and I think that was, in hindsight, a very sensible choice because they've become an increasingly important resource as bilateral donors have shrunk. But what about other newer funders, impact investors, other types of foundations, and the private sector themselves in certain circumstances at that more international level, expanding the range of scaling partners? Thanks.
Well, I have about 100 questions, but it feels selfish, and I now see a bunch that have appeared in the chat. Why don't you all come on screen for a minute? And Todd, why don't you, if you've been following this, the chat, why don't you pick a couple that you particularly struck you?
Great there. Thanks, Larry. I'd love to tee a couple of these up, and let me mash a couple of these together just to start with, and then I'll move based on time to the next set of questions. So this is really on risk management and the catalytic role of your foundation. So interesting to hear that these foundations generally view themselves as catalytic, but not ultimately responsible for scaling. If that is the case, who is responsible for scaling? And maybe an offshoot of that is aiming for just impact at scale rather than deep impact at scale could lead to investing in lower risk solutions that have large reach. I think we see this with some foundations. How much risk are foundations willing to take to support higher risk solutions that could deliver deeper impact initially at lower scale? So over to you, Larry.
Okay, Danny, you want to go first on that? That's a great question.
Sure. Really
pick any piece of it that speaks to you.
Softball question to start off with. I do think the first part of the question is relatively easier for me to answer, which is in the education space. I think who's responsible for scaling is government, which has already made a commitment to educate citizens in countries around the world. So that's sort of the easy part of the answer. In terms of the second half around risk. I think that's a great question. And I think there can be foundations who choose to invest at different sort of places in the scaling pipeline and think about that differently. I think often foundations don't go for scaling because they see that piece as risky, particularly this piece around engaging with government is perceived as risky because you suddenly are losing control over, you know, some of the sort of impact side of things. So I think we can think about risk differently along this chain. And I think, yes, I think there should be work to say what are these, to ongoing in an ongoing way, think about innovations that could get us to deeper impact, but also not to sort of say we aren't willing to take the risk of working through government systems, which I think is also a challenge.
Hey, if you want to go next.
Sure, maybe I can pick up on the part of the question around kind of depth of impact and deep impact. And I do think, by putting all three dimensions, impact, scale, and durability, co-equal with one another and co-visible, I think it's important to think about the effect as you manipulate each of those three variables. So you can have, and the most obvious example of this is when you maximize on impact for, an outstanding effect size, 0.5 standard deviations or whatever it might be, if you're not also deeply focused on the cost, the complexity, and other dimensions of that, you risk creating what sometimes is referred to as like a gold-plated solution that unfortunately will never be viable at the scale of the problem, or at least in a way that is durable and sustainable over the long run. So figuring out like what is that, and it's not easy. It's in fact very difficult to kind of try to solve all three at once. But I think one dimension of maybe how to think about that is what's the role of continuous improvement? We often evaluate these efforts in a snapshot way, where we take like a 1 or 2 year kind of snapshot and say, okay, what does the RCT say is the effect size in this moment, right? When actually, like, we know whether it's the private sector, the public sector, like change management, which is really the underlying dimension of a lot of this work when we're talking about change at scale. Like that takes time, and it's a very human process. And really, if we have the frame of continuous improvement and long-term durability, like it may help us reframe some of these debates where it becomes less of a fight really between, well, we have to have greater effect size, but no, it's not sustainable at scale, whatever. Like it may help us to kind of move beyond that into a more positive and kind of developmental framing, for lack of a better term.
Yeah, that's a thoughtful answer. Matt, do you have something you want to add on that?
Yeah, maybe I'll focus more on the first part of the question in terms of responsible party for scaling. I wouldn't necessarily use the term responsible party, but who's the critical partner for scale, right? So it's really not philanthropies. We're too small. We're often external to these systems. We lack certain authorities, and especially for Gates, right, we're time bound. So it won't be around. So we shouldn't be the one that's responsible, per se, for scaling. The critical partner for scale is really going to vary by the problem and the system you're working on, right? For many solutions in health, for example, the critical partner is going to be government. Education, right, we just heard, is largely going to be government as well. Whereas in other areas, for instance, many solutions in climate resilient and productive agriculture and food systems, it's going to be private sector and the private markets that are the critical partner in those cases. So it's really just tailoring the scaling pathway and approach to that. And there's one quick thing, I think Abe did a great job discussing the second part of the question, but very quickly, philanthropy is risk tolerant, but not risk blind, right? So we should definitely be pushing to take more risks, but we need to balance that against some decisions when it comes to impact and impact where we think is likely to be achieved or potential to be achieved.
Simon, I'm going to skip you on this one because I want to get at least one more question before we go on to part 2. Is that all right? Okay. Todd, give us one more.
Yeah, this is a great segue since government is mentioned repetitively. So a number of questions we're actually asking you guys to dive into that a little bit deeper. If I could summarize it a bit out for all of you, is there a model where the donors and foundations have worked directly with governments and supporting them without the intermediaries in their efforts to catalyze funding and impact at scale? So what does that look like for systems change and for working with them directly as counterparts to the overall work you're trying to achieve? Larry?
Yeah, Simon, I think I'll let you go first on that. In this case, if you want to draw on your more recent experience with Rockefeller as well as the Gates example, that'd be fine.
Sure. So on the Rockefeller side, we have problems working directly with government as a grantee, for example. So we have to have some kind of intermediary. That could be a nonprofit organization, could be some kind of a collaborative. So, for example, not in my part of the foundation, but the main food team has recently, earlier this year, launched a partnership with the World Food Program and other philanthropies to scale school meals adoption by governments under something called the School Meals Accelerator. So there it's a collaborative structure. The public partner is the World Food Program, and Rockefeller is funding about a quarter of the $100 million commitment there. On my portfolio, we are looking at working in partnership with governments, for example, in very hardest places like Somalia, the Philippines, and Haiti. But our grantees will be nonprofits who are then part of a local system play to work themselves then with governments. On the Gates side, I think the one example where Gates that I'm aware of worked very directly with government was on this digital public infrastructure agenda, because it was public infrastructure and they had to work directly with government. But I'll leave Matt to give a broader emphasis on where Gates stands on this.
Yeah.
Yeah, maybe on that, just pick it up on that one, right? Digital public infrastructure, public is in the middle. So working with government is essential to achieve scaling in that instance. And so similarly to Rockefeller, I think to a lot of philanthropies, providing grants directly to government is difficult for a number of different reasons, but certainly there are many solutions where sustainable scale really does mean understanding and responding directly to what countries are seeing as their priorities or needs. And so just one additional example, the Ministry of Finance in Uganda, an old grant that I had was working directly with the Ministry of Finance to help strengthen their ability to integrate climate risk data into macro fiscal projections and models. So it's responding directly to a request or a need that the government has identified, but working through local partners and institutions, thereby increasing their own capacity and their ability to provide objective advice, guidance, information to the government that would then inform public policies.
And is that the same or different for you?
I would say we've done a lot of the same and working with partners who work closely with government. And we have also at Echidna Giving done very recently started to do some direct funding to semi-autonomous government entities. So an example of that is in Kenya, we funded the National Examinations Council to think more about their measurement of higher order thinking skills. And, you know, they have plenty of money to do kind of their ongoing work, but not always to do sort of the innovative pieces. And so have given them some funding to think about how do we measure these higher order skills and then embed that into our ongoing assessment work. So we've done some experimentation more directly with these semi-autonomous government bodies.
How's that look from the co-impact side?
Yeah, I would say very similar to what Dana described, actually. Most of our work is to NGOs providing technical assistance and support to governments, and sometimes, but there are a handful of cases where we are funding these quasi-autonomous government agencies also. I will say maybe a couple further points. One is, you know, in the chat, someone from Spring Impact, I think it's Emma who's here, recently just did a wonderful report on some of this work, the dynamics of kind of partnering with government. So I'd encourage people to check that out if they haven't seen it yet.
I second that recommendation.
It was just launched at Skull, and I was glad to be in the conversation there. The final thing I would say, though, is for all of us, both ourselves when we're engaging with government, especially as global-based international donors, not locally in and of the context, and just in general, also true for the change leaders. When we talk about durability and that aspect of kind of the goal, the piece around, and it's subtle, but it's really important, the sense of ownership. Like, what sense of ownership does government and government at all the different levels feel and have around the work? Do they see it as something that is just another development project, another USAID project, another RTI project, another Commonics project, et cetera, that they will tolerate and they will give permission for, right? Or do they see the work as something deeply core to them, to their position, to their function, to their responsibilities, to their priorities. Because I think the latter is actually really what we need to aim for to have any chance at kind of durability of work and sustainability and change. And I think it often gets shortchanged, right? And oftentimes because of funders. Our ways of accountability, our metrics, our timelines, our grant horizons can drive so much towards short-term outputs and activities. And oftentimes that comes at the expense of that long-term ownership, responsibility, and leadership, which I think the more we can cultivate that, the better kind of results in the long term we have the chance of achieving.
Let me invite Simon and Dana, no, sorry, Matt and Dana and Abe to briefly go off camera. Simon, stay. And let me ask you a question about challenges. And in this case, I'm interested in what others that you interviewed inside Gates said to you when you were asking them questions about this scaling approach and integrating it into what they do or what they might do. What did they come back with in terms of the constraints or the problems or just the challenges that they faced in trying to do that? And I'm interested also if you could put it into the same response in whether that rang true to you or whether you felt there was a certain amount of rationalization in that.
That last part is the tricky part. So I think as I remember, and this is now, the exercise was done almost 18 months ago, so I'm drawing on my memory here. But as I remember, one of the things I think that was a challenge as I started to look at, sense making across the different PSTs and even individuals within the different PSTs, but that people had their own different backgrounds. And as I mentioned before, these are very, experienced, technically very strong people. But a lot of them are more on the science side or the innovation side and so on. They're not political economists, for example, and so on. So they had a wide diversity, I would say, in terms of the ways of thinking about how to scale, given those diverse backgrounds, and the starting points for scaling as well. So that was one challenge as I was trying to sort of wrap my head around, is there a kind of schema here? As I mentioned in the introduction, no hesitation in terms of the underlying commitment. No, we want to achieve impact at scale. Everything that Matt said, I was totally validating from what I heard and stuff. But it was more this like, how do we get going, and what does success look like in terms of scaling pathways and scaling outcomes on the way to that impact at scale. I think the second thing was this perspective that varied quite widely. Is it a product solution? And is that, the best way to achieve impact at scale? Or is it more of a system change, system strengthening solution? Or is there some combination thereof that's needed? And there, even within program strategy teams, I would see a diversity often of response. So alignment around, the core versus the enablers, I would say sometimes was a challenge. And then I think thirdly was, and Matt also talked about this, because there hasn't been a huge amount of, let's say, cross-PST conversations about, what are these scaling approaches? What's a broader, overall umbrella framework for the foundation around scaling? What are some of the metrics? What are some of the lessons we're learning, and so on? Because of that lack, then, more deeply embedding, let's say, a more comprehensive wholesale approach to scaling, recognizing, as Matt said, the diversity of pathways that's needed, also was a conversation that I felt wasn't happening enough. And therefore, that idea of then how do you go beyond into more deeper embedding was a conversation that was happening within the PSTs, but not really across the foundation.
Matt, let me ask you to pick up on that, but I want to add in a couple of specific questions if I could. One is the way impact is measured, what people feel accountable for in what they do. Does that tend to drive people toward things where the attribution is closer, the kind of project model fits more easily and so on. And secondly, time span, what people think of as a typical relationship duration, and whether you've seen that to act as a deterrent to the way people engage around things which in their heart of hearts they would know scaling would take a more diffuse and a longer period of time.
Yeah, both the questions. Maybe I'll answer those two first, and then I'll turn some responses on what Simon shared. I mean, I think what we measure and what we're held accountable to definitely influences kind of how we design programs and strategies, right? I think there is some of that influence of what is a reasonable amount of time frame to identify some of these intermediate outcomes that we're aiming for. I think there is, related to the second part of your question, that challenge, when we have a 2045 end date, that is one of the biggest challenges I think we have when it comes to scaling, because 19 years is not a lot of time when you think about strategy cycles and grant making timelines, which can take longer, and building partnerships. And so if we are to fail, we want to fail relatively quickly and learn what we can from those processes, understanding that true scaling, transformational scaling, building some of these partnerships takes time. But we're not starting from nothing. It's not like we're starting today and 19 years from now we're not going to exist. We have 26 years behind us of learning what works, building these relationships, understanding what works technically, what the right scaling pathways are, what the type of partners are, what resources and assets we need internally to deploy to actually get to where we need to go. So it definitely is a challenge, and there's always that tension between what we can sort of think, measure in the short term and what our ultimate objectives are. And I don't think we're ever going to get over that tension, but we can do what we can to identify intermediate outcomes and try to have a very candid conversation internally about what's working, what's not working, what switches we may need to make, and how flexible we need to be, while also respecting the partners that we've built in the field and not just abandoning them, the next day. That's not appropriate behavior for philanthropy. You need to think through responsible exit strategies. That being said, a couple of things I just wanted to highlight, some of the other challenges. So one, we've already talked about, and some of these are gate specific, some of these are broader. One, we've talked about the diversity of the scaling approaches. It does make it very difficult to keep that flexibility while building some common understanding about what good practices look like. I think number two, and this is something Simon touched on when he talked about sort of products, is there's an inherent risk, I think, and a lure to find the best solution and then how to scale that solution, right? Transformational scaling often requires us to ask a different question, which is much earlier in the process, which is, what is the best solution that can feasibly scale, right? And it's not always the same thing. There can be a technically excellent solution, but it's too expensive, too complex, requires external subsidy, that's not sustainable, misaligned with local incentives. So the scaling question has to be built into the innovation question from the very beginning. And I think there's always going to be a bit of a tension, particularly in funders that are innovation focused, like the Gates Foundation is. A third challenge I'd mention really quickly is just the external financing environment. A lot of folks know there's a lot of reductions in terms of the concessional finance available. Official development assistance is decreasing significantly, and it's forcing us and other philanthropies and development partners to think through NDBs, local and global private capital markets, public sector in ways we didn't think of before. And that requires different skills and approaches and partnership models internally than what we've had in the past. And so building those internally, those skills and those capabilities for the next 19 years is going to be a challenge, and it's a challenge for all philanthropies, I think. I know I'm probably running out of time. What's political economy? Political economy is something I think that is really important, right? It's not just, scale is not just a technical question. It requires a lot of things related to institutions and incentives. And we can de-risk technologies or models, but we're not necessarily we're definitely not substitutes for governments, and we're not necessarily good at managing political economy. But there's a good analogy where, political economy is the weather. You really shouldn't ignore, you can't change it, but you can't ignore what it is. You have to take that into account when you're designing your models and your strategies. And the very last thing I'll say is on that 2045 end date. I think that really changes the questions we ask and the tempo and the intensity and the time frame that we're thinking of when we're actually trying to scale. It's not only what did we fund, but what can change and what will endure beyond us existing. And so summarizing the challenge, it's moving from can this work to can this work at scale in real systems with sustainable ownership and financing? And that is a much harder question, right? But it is definitely the right question for philanthropy in general to ask, and especially for us, given our 19 years remaining.
Dana, I'm guessing you agree with a lot of what Matt and Simon had to say. You perhaps more than, well, maybe Abe would be in a similar position, but you very much have a responsibility for driving this internal to your own organization. And trying to do that, what's really struck you as the most binding constraints?
Well, I think, yes, I certainly do. A lot of the points already raised resonate. For us, I think one of our biggest tensions, I want to return to the issue of ownership that Abe raised earlier and articulated very clearly vis-a-vis government, right? That if governments don't own what you're trying to advance as a solution, it's not going to go anywhere at scale and in a durable, lasting way. We think about that a lot too, vis-a-vis our partners, right? So we think that, we can't, as Echidna Giving, come to an organization and say, hey, we have the perfect strategy for you. I think you should just do X, right? We think that really where we're going to get change is when those organizations themselves have deep ownership over what they're trying to achieve, and therefore are going to keep their eye on that impact, are going to iterate and improve and continue at it in a really deep way. And that means that we see ourselves sort of towards the trust-based end of the spectrum when it comes to our philanthropic practices. And we find that has come into tension with some of our work at scaling, because increasingly, as we think about, okay, what does it take to add up different pieces towards change, we find ourselves thinking more about the strategy side of things. And we've also had instances where organizations have come to us and said, hey, in this space, we're having trouble collaborating. There's a lot of tension between this organization and that organization. Can you, as Echidna, come in, step in, and be a little bit of a neutral broker in terms of aligning us all around a shared purpose and direction? And that has, come with tensions between, do we step in and do that? And then sort of, we're not quite the backseat donor that we typically see ourselves as, but maybe we are going to be able to enable a bigger change. And how do we just navigate those tensions? Because I think there's a fine line between, coming in and taking over. And so that's something that we're just constantly sort of navigating, how to both be supportive of bigger change, but also not take the ownership on ourselves, and make sure that that's still very much led by folks who are more in the driver's seat. And then I guess the second thing I would say that we face internally as a tension is just a constant, I would say, productive debate internally, and sometimes internal to any individual, or sometimes across team members of, scaling through government, knowing that that's, how we're going to reach the most people, and also knowing that given the way systems are structured and given the way power is allocated, that marginalized populations are marginalized in those systems for a reason. And so we have productive debates about where do we lean in on our grant making with government and through government, and where do we think about how do we actually try to meet the most marginalized communities? What does it take for them to have a space in the system and get the services that they deserve as well? So this tension between scale and equity and inclusion, I would say, is another one that's really, at the forefront of our minds internally.
Thanks. Abe, how does it look from your point of view?
I'd echo, a lot of what's been said, and maybe to just pick up the thread from Dana just now, a couple of things. I think there are challenges that are technical and challenges that are more human, right? And I think that's probably true across all of us and all our colleagues out in the sector. The technical challenges, I think, are around things like benchmarks, measurement, timeframes, metrics, and many other things. But how, I've seen even in the chat, like the question of how does one measure government ownership, right? How does one measure progress towards that? We have some degree of understanding of how to measure technical ownership, sustainability, financial government commitment, and so forth. But some of those softer things, how do we measure change in mental models? right? Which is a part of this work. And what are good benchmarks around the timeline? So Matt talked earlier about like, 19 years is like such a short, it feels so short. But 19 years, I would say, for most of philanthropy, unfortunately, is seen as an eternity. Very, very few, if any, organizations that I know think on that kind of time scale. But as Matt rightly said, like that is the kind of time scale that this work takes. But I don't think we have a shared understanding of that in the sector today, at least not that is explicit rather than implicit, right? So there's those technical aspects, but I also think the human dimensions are also very real. So things like ego, control, novelty, these all interplay with how we show up. This work often requires, again, especially for the in service of that long-term ownership by government and other key actors in the system, it requires a sense of humility and patience and quietness, really, in many cases, not every case, but in many cases, that is quite contrary to the way typically development and funding and philanthropy and change work has been done. We talk about the no ego, no logo approach, right? Like we hear that from our partners who are successful all the time, where they don't need their names to show up on any document, on any convening. If the government is the one with their names on the page in the meeting, whatever, like that is a win. They talk about needing to kind of go at the pace of government and the pace of trust with their partners and collaborators. And sometimes that means taking 2 or 3 more years than they originally expected to achieve a certain. But again, it's all in service of like, this is the end goal we're trying to get to, durable change at the scale of the problem. And therefore, to do that, it means we have to work in these ways. And so it's that the more we can keep that guiding star front and center and work backwards from there to inform all of our, like there's never a simple answer, but I do think it's navigating these trade-offs with that in mind constantly is really kind of the secret sauce to all of this.
Todd, it's your cue again. Give us a question or two that really struck you in the chat.
Yeah, this is hard to parse through because there's so many great ones that we won't be able to get to, but let me dive in here with one that talks about dynamics. So how do we treat scaling challenge in a dynamic way? An intervention may be proven at a time and in a place, but over time it will likely need to evolve. How does this scaling process take into account the need to equip host country institutions to ensure the implementation beyond fidelity, to manage the inevitable and need to revise the core model and the approaches for its dissemination? I know that's a huge area that the scaling community is really parsing with. So I'd love to hear some of the insights from you guys.
This time I'll let people choose. Who'd like to speak to that? Come on. Go ahead, Ed. You start.
Happy to kick us off, but I mean, I think there's a couple of pieces that come to mind for you. One is like we have to be super, super realistic and pragmatic about what's possible, right? Like I think we often default to quite complicated, technically sound solutions that are completely unrealistic in any kind of lasting way in many of the contexts and systems that we're talking about. So I do think it is that, how do we equip the system for continuous improvement? But I think it's in a realistic and sustainable way is kind of the piece of it. I would also say, again, I'll come back to like ownership and political economy, right? Like those two dimensions, like what is the motivation to drive that continuous improvement? Like, how does that motivation in the system, so not only the technical capability, but that will to do so, I think that's really important. I think we're starting to see a handful of really exciting examples. There's something in Brazil in foundational learning called the Sobral model that Lamam Foundation and others have kind of pioneered that have helped driven. I mean, it's just the most sophisticated way of solving all of these dimensions at the same time with incredible kind of results in children's learning improvements. So how do we help elevate some of these examples of how to get both the technical and the political human dimensions of this right so that we do get that continuous improvement and adaptation over time?
Anyone else?
Yeah,
I'll just add.
Go ahead,
David,
and then ask.
Okay, I was just going to add, I was going to actually draw a link to another question that came up earlier in the chat around how do we think about political sustainability, which is an issue that organizations struggle with. I think for us, we've actually sort of, in the way we've framed some of our principles, frame ourselves both as a systems change and field building organization. And I think this field building piece, the way we think about it, is what are the sets of organizations that are going to really continue to push on an issue, even if the political window is not open, and are going to, continue to build the demand for those solutions, which I also think is linked to building the demand for continuous improvement as well. So thinking about both how do we push for this change when the windows are open, but how do we also create the environment in which we can open the window itself.
That's beautifully said. That's great. Simon?
Yeah, two quick points. One related to the Gates Foundation and the DPI approach. So Gates went deep on DPI in India, building off what the Indian government with business partners have done on developing the digital IDs back in the, I think, sort of 2007-9 kind of era. But then said they're not going to do that with other countries. It's going to be too time consuming and too expensive. So they then set up a scaling incubator, if you like, that would then take those lessons from India into other countries, engage with the governments, and then when the governments were ready to receive that support, they would then work through that platform, and that then gave them the opportunity to crowd in other partners and so on. And also it gave them the opportunity to say no sometimes if governments weren't truly committed to adopting the DPI. On my own experience with Syngenta Foundation and the legacy of Syngenta Foundation, as we've thought about how do you scale last mile, first mile, young women, men entrepreneurs as change agents for smallholder farming, we've taken a very context-specific approach, which means you're constantly adapting and constantly reinventing according to the local context. And especially as you get sort of further away from the tarred roads in the cities and so on, it gets instrumentally more expensive and harder to do the scaling out. But that has to be part of that approach. And that, I feel, is often where things fall down is, it goes back to that earlier discussion about, do you just scale the low-hanging fruit? And you might have great success, but you're not solving the problem. You're only solving the easy to solve part of the problem.
I'm going to come back to you all in just a minute for a kind of a closing remark about what you think is most important to take away from all this. But I want to take a second just for those who haven't had a chance to see it themselves to summarize what came from the 8 case studies as part of the 28 case studies. So remember, for those of you who were here at the beginning of the webinar, I explained that we'd done 28 case studies, 8 of which were private foundations. These are 3 of the 8. So the synthesis report that was in the chat box before is the overall 28. I'm now telling you a couple of conclusions we reached from the 8, of which these would be 3 stellar examples. The first would be that more than I would have imagined, and I've been working at this for a while now, much more than I would have imagined, there are real comparative advantages that private foundations have that nobody else does equally well. I knew there were a couple, and it's a longer list. If you look at the individual case studies and look at the reporting that we've tried to collect around it, it's a pretty long list of things that, because they aren't dealing with appropriated funds, because they can do some of these long-term flexible things, because they can fund some kinds of intermediation that are difficult for official funders, there's a range of things that private foundations can do if they're inclined to that are not as easily done by official funders. The second, and you heard some really good examples of this today, is sometimes it's non-financial support that's critical, either alongside or even instead of the financial support in terms of what it takes to bring these things together. Sometimes it's convening, sometimes it's networking among people, sometimes it's helping to fund advocacy functions, and so on. The third is that we were really struck by the role of what you might call single purpose or sometimes domestically funded philanthropies. This was something that hadn't been studied a lot before, and we looked at 2. They're not on this particular panel, but we looked at one in South Africa and one in Colombia, and we studied the one that Abe referred to in Brazil, and one also very imaginative one in India. And the conclusions were the same. They become part of the local infrastructure in a way that's very difficult for any third-party outsider to do. So there are roles that some of these organizations play that, again, was a pleasant surprise to me, but I think an under-realized asset in terms of trying to make change happen. And similarly, where there were single focused organizations like Echidna Giving that really stayed with a theme for a very long time, they became a player in the field, and people began to afford them trust and relationship building capabilities and things that just wouldn't be possible if they were a conventional project funder. We saw 3 good examples of that. The fourth thing we saw was that a lot of philanthropy, not enough yet, but a lot of philanthropy was shifting from what we originally might have thought of as a charity focus to this sort of change-making focus, and really had absorbed the lessons, with or without using the vocabulary, about transformational scaling. And so I wouldn't call it the predominant view yet, but if you compare, as Abe and I were saying, this year's goal to last year's goal, never mind 10 years ago, the shift is very evident, and it's important, and it's impressive. The fifth insight we had was that fragmentation is not only still, it's a bigger problem than it was before. Namely, there are now large numbers of organizations in similar spaces trying to make things happen, and I'm going to my last point now, and often having realized to do so means to work through governments. So the governments before were suffering from these people trying to go around government. Now they're having, I would say, a better problem, but a problem nonetheless, which is everyone trying to go through government. So trying to figure out what that looks like in terms of platforms and management is, I think, in some ways the next challenge for how people engage around these sorts of issues. Let's see if we have time. We have time for one more question, Todd, from the audience, then I'm going to turn to people for final remarks.
Right, here's a fun one, and we touched on it when we were reviewing kind of challenges, but just to basically put it back out there, what does the philanthropic sector as a whole, including your own foundation, most consistently get wrong about what it takes to achieve scale? Have fun with that one.
Okay, Matt, you go first on this one.
Thinking it through. I mean, I think we don't always plan for contingencies in different scenarios in place because things change quite rapidly, right? I mean, we definitely saw them in the development finance space over the last few years. And I think some philanthropies, I'm not saying ours or not saying others, some philanthropies were maybe caught flat-footed a little bit by the shift and how quickly things shifted within the space. And so I think that's the big challenge, not thinking through all the different potential sort of partnership strategies or different scenarios that may be necessary because things do change really rapidly.
Thanks. Simon, if you had to pick one, what would you say people most consistently get wrong?
Well, I agree with Matt's point, but I think it's thinking about the different layers that are required to achieve true impact at scale that's durable, as Abe was guiding. I think often there's a focus on one layer, so it could be the product layer, or it could be the policy layer, or it could be the state capability layer, rather than seeing the entire layers, and then the lack of that adaptive management that we were just talking about previously.
Dana?
I'm going to say actually something that now I'm stealing my own closing remarks, so that's not great. But I do think I think what we often get wrong is just not giving a long enough time horizon for things. That we just foundations are revisiting strategies every 3 years, which how can we expect to shift systems in that amount of time? I don't think it's realistic, and I think we're essentially working our way out of one of the very important comparative advantages that we have as a funder.
What do you think, Abe?
I mean, all resonate with me. So I'd agree. I would maybe build on Simon's to say, like, I think it's about the combination of the technical capacity as well as the human incentives and ownership at all different levels of government, and really truly assessing where those sit and how best those can be strengthened, aligned with, and so forth. I think we're often not realistic or kind of close enough in our and us and our partners. Like I think I'm using the collective we when I talk about that.
Let me let you keep going if you would. If you were going to leave our audience with kind of one major takeaway, what do you think is most important that well-intentioned people take away from the growing experience around scale and scaling? Abe, sorry.
Sure. Happy to kick us off. I mean, for me, it really is this piece around durability of change and unpacking that. Like, I think it's about the technical durability, sustainability over the long run at scale, the financial dimensions, obviously, but also the political durability, the durability of ownership, and the durability of changes in mental models. I think if we can make that goal of durability co-equal with scale and impact, I think we'll put ourselves in a much better place as a sector to try and create the change that we hope to see in people's lives.
Matt?
Yeah, I mean, I think the most important takeaway for me is that philanthropy is not about just finding promising solutions and making them bigger, but it's really about whether we can create the conditions for impact to continue at scale without us being there, right? Because we are not the central scaling partner. And I think that means really thinking about scaling earlier in the process, but also throughout the process. And creating sort of a theory of change, a theory of scale, I should say, that considers the different elements, to Simon's point, the different types of scaling or different drivers for scaling, and then revisiting that throughout the process. I like Dana's point, fully agree with it. We revisit our strategies too often. So not revisiting the strategy constantly changing it, but making the changes that are necessary when the scaling conditions change.
Thanks. Simon?
Well, just building perhaps a little bit off the previous two comments and taking a leaf out of the playbook I'm trying to work with at the moment in my current portfolio, starting with the vision. What is that sustained, durable system that you're trying to catalyze impact through look like once it's successful? And then working backwards from that and recognizing that much as we might all want to have 15 year plus time commitments, not everybody will, and different actors are going to come in at different points in the process, both as innovators, as players, as capacity builders, and most importantly as funders and investors, and creating space for all of that in a system architecture that enables that vision to be achieved. Of course, it takes time to put that together, and you can't map the entire 15 years right at the beginning. But if you know where you're going, it's much easier to get on the train and take the journey.
Thanks. And Dana?
Such great points that folks have already raised. I guess where I would land is that sort of back to a point that came up earlier. I think maybe Abe was the first to raise this, that yes, it's about the technical pieces, right? It's about our strategy and how we measure it and what we fund, but it's also equally important, the human piece of how we fund. And what are the ways that we show up in support of partners and government? And what are the sort of mental modes that we sort of embody in those relationships that are also really critical for this ownership, motivation, and sort of lasting change side of the equation?
I hope everybody who's listening enjoyed this conversation as much as I did. I'm going to try and give it a tail if I can. One, a very specific tale, which is there are a whole series of questions I've been looking through in the chat that I think are terrific and that we have not fully dealt with. And let us in the community of practice try to figure out with the panelists some way we can respond on at least some of those questions, maybe in the next newsletter or something of that sort. The second is I want to draw people's attention to something that we are trying to do, which is to mobilize not just the collective learning, but the collective enthusiasm for trying to change the way we do some of these things into what we've been calling a campaign, which is to really think about what would it take to not only make it possible for, but to put a little bit of pressure on systems, particularly those that have been shown the most recalcitrance or the most difficulty in changing, to move in the direction of what we're increasingly learning is necessary if there's going to be durability to the change, if it's going to be at scale, and if it's going to have the kind of impact that needs to. And for me, at least, that's not just a collective learning problem, that's a collective action problem, and trying to figure out how we actually mobilize ourselves as a community in the loosest sense, but hopefully in a somewhat less loose than now sense, to try to make this happen is the challenge we've set ourselves about. So for those of you who are with organizations that either can help to drive that or can benefit from it, we really want to hear from you. We really want to figure out what it is we can do as a community. I'm talking about the 5,000 of us, to try to not just help ourselves, but to try to influence what's going on in the world. And so some of you are very deeply involved in that, I know already. And I think we can do much more together than we can do alone. So to whatever extent we can take the kinds of lessons people have been talking about today, turn them into some sort of an action agenda that we can disseminate and advocate for, I want to believe the world would be better for it. What I do know is that those of us who had the good luck to listen in today are better for the four of you who spoke today. And I really want to thank you individually for doing that. Come back on screen just for a second. So I couldn't have thought of a better panel for this than the one we had. That was not only incredibly insightful, but you were really, really honest about stuff which is, you'd want to say in common currency, but it's not. And I want to thank you for being as forthcoming as you were and sharing the stuff that you did. So thank you all for listening, and thanks in particular to our panelists for such a wonderful, wonderful session. Bye-bye, everyone.